Within every group, one person will always emerge as the leader. It's the natural order of our species to fall into social roles. We align ourselves and unify through like-minded ideologies. But when a new element is introduced, the harmony of the group is disrupted. Disagreement will spawn a new leader, one that separates from the fray and challenges the old leader. Our kinship is tested, and in the end, only one leader will prevail.
Do you ever miss home?
Nigel stood 10 feet away, his back turned to me. His suit obscured the direction his eyes were gazing towards, but I knew he was looking up at the sky. "This is our home," I responded with confidence. "We live here." His voice crackled through my earpiece.
You know what I mean, Al.
He raised his arm and extended his palm toward the stars above.
Earth.
"We're never going back. It's been 20 years. I don't really think about it anymore." I turned away and overlooked the thriving community we had built together with pride in my chest. Nigel had named our community Cronus, after the Greek god of agriculture when we first landed, and the name stuck, despite headquarters preemptively naming it Spirit after the rover that landed here in 2004. Cronus was now a series of living units spanning across 36 different pods. There were only 2 when we first arrived. In 20 years, we've gone from 4 people to 72. Remarkable, if I do say so myself. My focus is occupied with the settlement, I continued, making sure the foundations for humanity on Mars are established, and we've exceeded our most optimistic goals by staying focused.
Christ. I miss Chinese food.
You say that a lot.
It's just... we've done our time here, don't you think? Oh, we're getting old, Al. We've built this settlement from the ground up together, gave our whole lives for this, and we don't even have much more to offer. Eventually, we'll be too weak to pick up the hammer. We'll be absorbing vital resources as we slowly die, rather than making further contributions to the settlement.
He stopped for a moment and let out a heavy breath into the headset.
Neil Armstrong went to the moon and then returned to Earth, where he was celebrated as a hero for humanity. Shouldn't we have the same privilege? Shouldn't we be living out the rest of our days on a beach in Hawaii instead of this cold, lifeless desert?
We knew what we signed up for, I assured him. I'm looking forward to living the rest of my days here and watching Cronus expand even further than it already has. Nigel turned and snickered at me, his eyes slightly bloodshot from what appeared to be tears. He expressed his thoughts on returning to Earth previously, but never had I seen the notion affect him the way it was now. Something wasn't right with him. "Nigel, what's gotten into you?" His only response was to lower his head to the ground and walk slowly past me, back towards the airlock. I watched him walk, a wistful man longing for something he'll never receive. As day turned to night on the Red Planet, I did my best to think of something to raise his spirits, but with resources limited, there was not much to offer. This place had no viable respite. Perhaps he envisioned our time here unfolding differently. Maybe he expected more to come of our time and our sacrifice, and simply laying the foundations for future generations was not the ultimate goal. 20 years is a long time to wait for something without the gratification of obtaining it. I can sympathize. I've spent countless nights awake in my living unit, staring at the ceiling, wondering what was happening on Earth, and envying those who were fortunate to indulge in luxuries I no longer had access to, and never would. Those thoughts lasted only briefly. The prospect of our mission eventually devoured all personal desire. Everyone at Kronos had those thoughts from time to time, and they would quickly fade. For Nigel, though, this time the thoughts were not fading. My old friend was losing his enthusiasm in life. He needed me. Before going to sleep for the night, I booted up my laptop and sent Nigel an email. "Tomorrow marks the 20th anniversary of our landing here. That's almost 11 Martian years. We should celebrate. Come to my living unit after morning audit. I've been hiding a bottle of whiskey that came with the last arrivals just for us." I clicked send and went to sleep, hoping the email would provide a little boost to his mood when he saw it. The morning came and brought with it the usual routine of checking diagnostics on the habitat for any potential issues. I greeted my unimate, Vanessa, when I awoke. She had come to Cronus 4 years ago, and we had shared our unit for the last 6 months. The living units rotated individuals regularly, so there wouldn't be any risk of growing too attached or agitated with someone. Socializing on Mars wasn't exactly frowned upon, but it was still viewed as a distraction. When you're one of only a few people on an entire planet, a petty squabble has devastating potential. We had our times of bonding together as a group, but for the most part, we tried to keep it to a minimum and stay focused on our work and staying alive. Vanessa and I, on the other hand, skipped the last rotation and stayed in the same unit. We made up some excuse about how moving her items may compromise her geological research. In truth, we just didn't want to be apart. Before she moved in, I had forgotten what it was like to make a deep connection with another person. Vanessa was still my unit mate to everyone here, but there were a few nights shortly after she moved in where our relationship went beyond the professional guise we displayed during the day. Soon, we stopped fighting the connection we had and embraced it. We cared deeply for each other. There was an unspoken agreement between Vanessa and I that we would keep our relationship secret to the rest of Cronus. We both knew no good would come of it. During the day, she would sometimes find a moment to show me she cared when no one else was around. She would place a light fingertip on the dorsal side of my hand and draw an imaginary heart. It was so endearing and always made me ecstatic, invigorating the youthful spirit that had dwindled over the years. Vanessa sat at a desk adjacent to her bed, typing away on her computer. I stared at her from behind for a moment, admiring the beauty of her long auburn hair cascading over the back of her swivel chair. "Good morning," I said to her with a smile. She turned in her chair and greeted me with a smile of her own.
"Morning."
"Did you sleep well last night?" She scrunched her nose and squinted her eyes.
"Not so great, actually."
"Oh, is everything all right?"
"Oh, I'm fine. I don't know. Couldn't get comfortable, I guess. Something just felt off to me."
"I'm sorry, sweetie," I said as I raised my body from the bed. I walked to the window and stared out at the red planet. Our living unit was on the very outer edge of Cronus and provided a spectacular view of the surrounding landscape of Gusev Crater. In the sky was a lone, shining beacon resting peacefully in the bleak light of dawn, Phobos. It was much smaller from the surface of Mars than Luna was to Earth, but I always saw it as much bigger than it actually was. I loved seeing it every day. There were never any clouds disrupting the view, only the occasional dust storm. Taking in the view every morning solidified my purpose in life. This was where I belonged. I was home. My attention was drawn to the LED alert on my computer, indicating new notifications. I sat at the desk next to Vanessa and brought up my HUD. The transparent screen came to life in front of me, the corner of the screen marked with a red 36 in my email. More than the usual day, likely because of the anniversary, I assumed. My inbox was filled with congratulatory messages, a couple reports from the automated algorithms that monitored stasis through Cronus and any possible contamination in the habitat, and one reply from Nigel. I had almost forgotten about the email I sent him the night before. I opened the reply from Nigel first. All he sent back to me was a 5-word response. "It's too late for that."
"What is it?"
"It's Nigel. I don't know." I rolled my chair over to the intercom and selected Nigel's living unit. "Nigel, are you there?" I waited nervously for a few seconds, each one ticking by with a loud thud in my chest. "Nigel, can you hear me?" Someone breathed slowly into the other end, puffing methodically into the microphone. "Nigel, is that you? Are you all right?" A weak voice finally broke through my speaker.
Can I go home now?
Speaking to him through the intercom wasn't optimal. Nigel was having some sort of breakdown and needed someone to calm him. I shot out of my chair and burst out of the living unit. Just outside my door was a group of about 30 people, all wearing party hats and holding up a small cake. They all shouted in unison, cheering my emergence. Laughter and clapping immediately followed, the group all thrilled to shower me with praise. This was either all a ruse or just terrible timing. Either way, I wasn't taking the risk. Without a word, I ran past everyone, determined to reach Nigel's unit. A few of the people all mumbled inexplicably as I ran past them.
What's gotten into him?
I heard a young man say. There wasn't any time to explain. I rushed through commons and down the hall to Nigel's unit and immediately swung his door open. Inside, Nigel sat on his bed, perched like a gargoyle. His face was red as the sun and his eyes were bloodshot. On the floor, between the two beds in the unit, was the body of his unit mate, Richard, partially covered with a white bedsheet. Only his blue, lifeless face protruded from underneath. The muscles in his face were frozen in a look of anguish. His mouth and eyes were open as though he were constantly reliving the last moments of his life. Around his neck were thick lines of bruised skin.
Can I go home now?
Nigel said in the same frail tone he had through the intercom. Nigel, what have you done?
Satellite link in 60 seconds.
Craig announced from behind his monitor. His fingers furiously clicked away at the keyboard. His eyes rapidly scanned the UI in front of him. Craig was always relentless in his IT skills. The trance he displayed now was pretty common, although I could detect his fingers were working faster than they ever had before.
What are you going to tell them?
Vanessa asked, standing over me while I sat in front of the monitor, waiting for the connection to establish. We'll tell them the truth, Miggy responded for us. He was another member of the original 4 who had first come to Mars. His name was Miguel, but he preferred to be called Miggy. The moniker accurately captured the quirky personality he often expressed. Today, though, his quirky nature had vanished. Next to him, Stephanie, the last of the original 4, stood. Her hair was unnaturally messy, and she looked as though she fell out of a tree. The whirlwind of the day's events preventing her from putting effort into her appearance. Vanessa gave a single nod of her head and put her hand on my shoulder.
Are you doing all right?
She asked in a voice slightly above a whisper. Honestly, I shifted my stiff head and met her gaze. No. She gave me a look of sympathy, then discreetly moved her hand towards the back of my neck. I felt her fingertips outline a heart over my skin, centered right on my spine. The sensation sent a comforting wave through my body. I looked at her and gave a subtle smile. She gave me one back.
30 seconds.
I took a deep breath and tried to sound professional. Thank you, Vanessa. We'll make an announcement to everyone after we're through here. She removed her hand, nodded, then turned and walked out of the room. The door whisked shut behind her, leaving the 4 of us alone. I nervously wiped the sweat off my forehead as I waited for the video feed to load. It had only been a little more than 2 hours since the discovery that shook Cronus. None of us would ever quite be the same. The foundations of our little society was dealt a devastating blow after the last member of the initial 4, as we were aptly referred to as around Cronus, turned out to be a killer. Nigel. The screen blinked and displayed a message I had grown accustomed to over the years. Connection established. The video feed opened in a separate window, where we were greeted with the board of directors of the Galileo Project, the organization responsible for the first colony on Mars. They sat around a lengthy oak table, seated comfortably in luxurious leather chairs. At the end of the table sat a familiar face, Ivan Samuel. I hadn't seen him in person in nearly 22 years, but I have watched his face grow wrinkles and his hair turn gray in our time apart. Ivan stood from his chair with a toothy grin and spoke enthusiastically.
Al, Miguel, Stefania, on behalf of the Galileo Project and everyone on planet Earth, congratulations on 20 years living on Mars.
The team around the conference table clapped their hands.
Well done.
I held up a hand and gave them a solemn look, then waited for the clapping to end. I'm afraid we have a bit of a situation here at Cronus. Ivan sat and slouched in his chair.
A situation? What kind of situation?
There's been a murder. The room gasped, and everyone shot confused looks at each other. One of our own here has killed another.
Who? Who is the killer?
Miggy huffed a deep breath loudly. I'm afraid it's Nigel, sir. He suffocated Richard Cloud in his sleep last night.
Are you joking?
He's not.
Oh my, this is terrible.
Ivan looked around the room in deep thought.
Why? Why would he do such a horrendous thing?
We're not entirely sure about that, but I believe he did it because he doesn't want to be here anymore.
You mean he wants to come back to Earth?
That's what he said. He keeps asking if he can go home. A cold silence fell over the feed, no one quite sure what to make of the news. Their blank stares at each other mirrored what I was feeling. We had no protocol for this, no plan for any kind of action. Prepping for life on Mars never included any training for handling murder scenarios.
Where is Nigel now?
A woman I recognized as Charlotte Werner, the CFO, asked.
He's isolated in his living unit. We've designated a surveillance team to keep an eye on his every move.
Good.
Why does he want to leave Mars?
I recalled the day before when Nigel confided in me. He spoke with me yesterday and made a comment about his age. He's 53 years old now. I think he's experiencing a transition of identity, a severe one. I took my eyes off the screen and stared out the window to my left, allowing myself a moment to get lost in my own thoughts. Mars looked different to me now compared to the morning when I awoke with Vanessa and admired Phobos in the dim sky. The events of the day cast a ubiquitous depression over the planet I called home. The endless red stretching to the horizon served as a reminder of the harsh conditions we occupied. All of us at Cronus were living in a place that nature never intended us to live in. We didn't fit. Mars was speaking to us, warning us. You cannot force life to exist where it didn't belong. My focus shifted from the window to the floor in front of me. Regardless of what Nigel had done, I still thought of him as my friend, a friend who was in need of help. I couldn't shake the feeling of guilt for not being able to help him. What he did was wrong, of course, but he still deserved sympathy. I think he should return to Earth.
Are you mad?
It would be best for everyone in Cronus. It's not like we have a prison to stick him in. The Galileo project cannot continue with him here. Ivan slammed the palm of his fist against the table and hastily raised himself out of the chair.
It's not like calling an Uber, you know. Do you have any idea how much it would cost? Not to mention how long it would take. Even if we had a craft ready to launch today, we couldn't do it. The planets aren't even aligned properly.
I'm fully aware that it would take some time.
At least 5 years. What are you going to do with him while you wait? Our model is built on sending people there, not bringing them back. We would have to build a specialty ship from scratch. All this on top of the inevitable lawsuits that are sure to follow.
It's not about money. The growth of Kronos is paramount. He's a liability here that will hinder our growth. He needs to go back to Earth and be brought to justice. Ivan placed both his hands on the table and leaned forward, his tone softening.
Look, Al. You and the people at Cronus are pioneers, like the early European settlers of Plymouth. Do you think the Pilgrims pestered England for matters of diplomacy?
I hardly think I'm pestering you.
I'm sorry, Al, but you're on your own. Cronus was eventually going to have social issues arise as more and more people are sent there. It's time you all come up with a way to deal with these things when they happen.
As much as I hated to admit it, Ivan had a point. In 20 years, we'd been lucky enough to avoid any serious confrontations, but it certainly wouldn't be that way forever. Humans will naturally encounter conflicts at some point, and what were we supposed to do with Nigel for the years that would follow as we waited for his departure? We understand, Miggy said, taking over the conversation. What do you advise we do with Nigel?
I would advise you to keep him isolated from the rest of the group. Lock him in his pod until he kills himself or dies naturally. But it's your decision, ultimately. Mars is outside of Earth jurisdiction.
He sat down in his chair again, grabbed a remote, and pointed it at the camera.
Kill him now, if you want, and make it quick. It's in your hands. Report back to us in 24 hours.
Connection lost. The video feed and the monitor went black. I sat there staring in awe at the screen, dumbfounded by the complete lack of remorse Ivan and the board displayed. Their concerns were that of selfish intent. I picked myself up out of the chair and exited the briefing without saying a word to anyone. Vanessa stood outside, leaning against a wall and biting her fingernail, waiting for me to exit the room. She locked eyes with mine and pushed herself off the wall as I approached.
What did they say?
Pretty much nothing. They can't bring him back to Earth, and they expect us to handle this internally. She nodded solemnly.
Not much else they can do, I suppose.
She stuck the tip of her finger back into her teeth and chewed at her nail.
What do we do from here?
We focus on rehabilitating him, isolate him in his cell, and dedicate Dr. Bakchis to conducting daily therapy with him until she can confidently say he's mentally healthy and able to rejoin the colony. She pulled her finger away and gave me a stern look.
You can't be serious.
Of course I am.
Al, he's a killer. You can't possibly think it would ever be okay for him to walk freely among us.
I'm not saying he'll return to his usual duties by tomorrow. It could take years, but what else can we do?
Throw him out the airlock.
The outburst was a side of Vanessa I had not seen before. The ordinarily gentle and nurturing personality she possessed had somehow disappeared. The transformation took me off guard. We're not barbarians, Vanessa.
He can't live with us, that's for sure. No one will trust him again. This is why I couldn't sleep last night. Something was off and my body knew it.
Are you listening to yourself? You're trying to justify murder.
I'm just warning you that there's going to be an uproar if you go this route. People are scared. There'll be chaos throughout Cronus if we don't punish him appropriately. And this colony you've worked so hard for and dedicated your life to will crumble faster than you could ever possibly imagine.
And how do you think we'd be able to live with ourselves after knowing we sentenced a man to death? She's right. A voice from behind me spoke. I turned and saw Craig, Miggy, and Stephanie all exiting the briefing room and walking towards the two of us. Miggy raised his arm in the air as though he were asking to be called upon by an elementary school teacher as we walked. I don't feel comfortable living with a killer, and I know with certainty that many others feel the same. Stephanie shook her head.
I'm with Al. We should make every effort possible to save him, before we place an irreversible and potentially erroneous judgment. We should be sure before deciding.
I had never been a fan of capital punishment, and that stance was not about to change. Life was precious, especially on a planet where it couldn't survive in its natural elements. We shouldn't be throwing it away. The entire concept of punishment and rehabilitation is to preserve life, not destroy it entirely without any chance of redemption. Rehabilitation was the answer. I knew in time he could progress to a functioning person again, but we were divided on the matter. Whatever decision we came to on our own would not satisfy everyone. The decision should not be ours and ours alone. We'll put the decision to a vote, rehabilitation or death. Cronus will decide as a collective unit. It's the only way to ensure civility among the people. We all agreed it was the best course of action, and set forth addressing everyone at Kronos in commons after everyone had gathered. Stephanie joined me in arguing for rehabilitation, while Miggy adamantly argued for the death penalty. There were times when the debate sparked outrage from within the people, and we had to calm everyone. At some points, people broke down crying. We spent countless hours going back and forth, nearly everyone speaking their opinions of what should be done. All the while, I could see Nigel down the hall, still in his living unit, perched on his bed. He showed little emotion and kept his attention on the floor where the body of Richard was found. It wasn't until Miggy stooped low enough to call him a degenerate waste that I finally saw a reaction from Nigel. He closed his eyes and slowly shook his head from side to side, clearly ashamed of himself. A man filled with grief should never be discarded. The consensus seemed to lean towards death. During my closing argument, I made a last-ditch effort to save his life. I called Nigel to speak in his own defense. The request seemed to catch Nigel off guard, as well as everyone else, but surprisingly, he obliged. He dragged his body through the middle of the crowd, walking as though he were carrying heavy weights at his side. He joined me in front of everyone and pleaded for his life.
I don't really know what to say to you all. I don't blame any of you for your anger towards me, because I'm angry with myself. I've done a horrible thing. Something I'll never forgive myself for.
He paused to collect himself, as he quickly became overwhelmed with emotion. His eyes welled up with tears, and he spoke with a crack in his voice.
But I'm not lost. Look at me. The man you've all known for years is still here, and he wants to come back and join you all. And with a little help, he can. Please, help the man you see before you.
Help him become a better person again.
He held his arms out to everyone.
Help me. Don't give up on me. Not yet.
His legs buckled and he fell to his knees. He buried his face in his hands and he wept uncontrollably.
Please, have mercy on me.
The vote was 34 to 37 in favor of rehabilitation. After the votes were tallied, I felt a wave of relief. I did my job to save a life. The destroyed perception I felt earlier about Mars had lifted itself off my shoulders and cast a new prospect of hope. We could continue to thrive. Cronus would live on. The menacing look shot at me by those who voted for death would soon fade once they saw progress. I just knew it. If we stayed on this path, there was a future for all of us here. A future for humanity on Mars. I assured that Nigel's living unit had a guard present and returned to my own living unit alone afterwards. Vanessa asked if she could speak with me, but hearing her support for the complete disregard of basic human rights, I was not quite ready to engage in further disagreement. I asked for some time to myself. Once I had a moment of privacy in my living unit, I reached under my bed and grabbed the bottle of whiskey I had stashed. My original intention was to share this with Nigel, but given the circumstances, sharing a drink with him wouldn't be right. I felt I had earned the drink without him. For the 20 years I dedicated to building a new world, and for upholding justice. I took a shot and plopped myself into bed, mentally exhausted from all that had transpired. The sun had started to fade when I took another shot and closed my eyes, drifting off into nothingness. Eventually, I was awakened by a loud bang coming from outside that seemed to echo through Cronus. My eyes shot open, and I realized I was surrounded by darkness. I had slept through sunset. The only source of light were the stars outside. I crawled out of bed and reached for the light just as the breach alarm sounded, indicating a rupture had occurred somewhere in Cronus. A breach had only happened once before during a dust storm about 6 years ago. A piece of metal had become dislodged and punctured a wall in an empty living unit. Luckily, there were security measures in place that would immediately seal any room with a breach to protect the rest of Cronus. No one was harmed in the incident. But what was causing this one? There was no storm outside and no reason for debris to be flying around, putting us at risk. I exited my room and immediately noticed a crowd gathered around Nigel's room.
Ow!
Stephanie shouted at me from across the commons.
Nigel's stuck inside. There's been a breach.
What? How?
Someone's outside. They've intentionally ruptured his living unit.
I stood in a dismal state of shock as the crowd buzzed in nervous waves. I was wrong. I thought Cronus would continue to thrive, but I underestimated the influence fear and the pursuit of self-preservation can have. Get him out! I screamed at Stephanie, simultaneously running across commons toward the wild commotion that overtook the entirety of the colony. Use the override switch to open the door! Nobody's touching anything! A voice I recognized as Miggy roared from within the crowd. Stay back! The crowd all began to move backwards, clearing a line of sight that led to Miggy, standing with his back against the door and his arms outstretched like a bird. He stood vigilant with a look of determination, guarding the door and preventing the rescue of Nigel. This is a group effort. From the other side, he was being tortured as the atmospheric pressure rapidly changed. He slammed his body furiously against the door in a frenzied panic. Nigel! I screamed. If you can hear me, use the emergency kit to patch the hole! Miggy shook his head at me. We removed the kit from his room. There's no escape. Stephanie held her ground, inching closer to Miggy as the rest backed away.
Miggy, how could you?
We're doing what's necessary. We have to protect the people of Cronus. She ignored his conviction and ran forward.
Get out of the way, you monster!
Miggy lunged at Stephanie, raised his hand and brought it down across her face. The slap sent Stephanie tumbling to the floor as the rest of us gasped in disbelief. The outline of a spacesuit outside passed by the window to my left, the person fleeing the sabotage they created. Craig appeared out of the crowd and bolted towards Miggy.
You son of a bitch!
He charged and tackled Miggy to the ground, pinning him against the floor and slamming his fists into his face. Each blow sent droplets of blood flying through the air. I took the opportunity to rush at the override button. I was only a few meters away from the controls when a fist swung and collided with my face. The impact set me stumbling, and I struggled to stay on my feet. By the time I regained composure and prepared to defend myself from another attack, the entire commons had erupted into a brawl. Bodies were contorted as they wrestled on the floor, everyone struggling to either save Nigel or ensure he dies. Amid the chaos, I moved to the override controls and pressed the button. As the door whisked open, the mayhem that was taking place subsided, everyone instead focusing on the door. A whistling sound immediately flew into the commons as the air pressure quickly changed. The skin on my face instantly felt as though it was being held against a roaring fire. As the door opened, Nigel's body fell forward and plopped on the floor in front of me with a loud thud. "Pull him out so I can close the door!" I yelled at nobody in particular. A woman grabbed Nigel by the collar of his shirt and dragged his body out of the clearing. Once he was out, I operated the controls and closed the door. Our efforts to save Nigel were too late. When his body was flipped over, his face was a horrifying disfigurement of its former self. His eyes bulged from their sockets and looked like two water balloons that had been filled to the maximum capacity and were about to explode. The blood vessels in his skin had all constricted, expanding the flesh of his face into a bright red ball. I held back an acidic taste that rose from deep within my throat. Mars had finished what it started on Nigel. It had fully consumed him and ended his life. "Spare your empathy for someone who's not a killer," Miggy commented, breaking the silence that had fallen over us. He lay on the ground, trying to recuperate from the beating he received from Craig. I ignored Miggy's heinous remark. There would be time to deal with him appropriately later on. He could have his victory. At the moment, there was still a person outside, lurking around Cronus, and still a potential risk. And I knew who it was. "You've won, Miggy. You and whoever else wanted this. Congratulations. You've destroyed everything we've worked for. And you will all be held accountable for your actions today." I paused and bit my lip, furious by the notion of what Cronus had succumbed to. How do we live with each other now? How can any of us sleep peacefully at night when the prospect of survival is determined by the will of another? I paused again, turning slowly and met Miggy's eyes before pointing my finger at him. 20 years. My entire life's work, the future ambition of humanity, all destroyed in an instant. All of it ruined and gone forever. "You'll pay for this!" I bellowed at him. An eerie silence devoured the room. Every person stood still and allowed the magnitude of our reality to sink in. I briskly turned and walked away from the scene.
Where are you going?
"I'm going to the airlock." I moved through commons, walking with a purposeful stride past the series of living units. Some of them were occupied with frightened people, all staring at me nervously as I passed them. She was already entering the airlock by the time I reached it. I could see the red lights blinking through the small window, an alert that the outside door was opening. Vanessa was coming back inside. "Are you happy with yourself?" I said into the headset as I positioned myself at the airlock controls. "You've destroyed this colony. Is that what you wanted?"
Al,
She walked up to the window and stared back at me.
I saw what happened inside the commons.
"You were so determined to get rid of a killer that you became a killer yourself."
Yeah, you're right.
The outside door closed behind her. I flicked the switch and the airlock came to life, whirling in a hiss as I optimized the pressure for her. "I shouldn't have listened to you," I admitted. She had given me a warning earlier that clemency would result in anarchy. I failed to comprehend the fear others had and assumed my altruistic efforts would humanize Nigel. The potential consequences were not considered. We are instinctively programmed to prioritize survival. Fear consumes us. It disrupts tranquility and motivates harmful actions. We should have punished Nigel.
No, you were right, Al. I see what we've become. I see it now. There's blood on my hands. That's not who I wanted to be.
She unhinged her helmet, then placed a finger on the window and outlined a heart. "What are you doing?" She looked back at me and tearfully said,
Goodbye, Al.
In one smooth motion, she pulled her helmet off and slapped the release button, opening the doors behind her. Her body collapsed, falling below the window and out of sight into an agonizing death. Cronus is done, I told Ivan, sitting face to face with him in the briefing room the next day. This time he met with me alone. The damage is irreparable. We had progressed faster than we could have anticipated. Cronus had changed, but we had not changed with it.
Right.
He replied, his face a blank stare.
Too many people, not enough regulation.
No one is willing to live under these circumstances any longer. I know it'll take time. We'll wait for you. He huffed in defeat.
Very well. We'll start working on an exit strategy.
Make sure there's enough to accommodate 58.
Aren't there 69 left?
I nodded and gave him a menacing glare. Miggy and his accomplices are being put to death as soon as this briefing is over. Hey everybody, I hope you enjoyed that story. This one was a little bit of a shorter one, and I would say it wasn't your traditional horror story. The fear in this one, I think, comes from the isolation and just being in that situation. Also knowing that help is so far away, and even if they wanted to come and help, it would take years for them to get there. There wasn't anything paranormal or alien related that I got in the story. It really was just about somebody kind of going crazy and killing somebody and then the ramifications of that. I think it's a really interesting premise, and it's a situation that I'd say is pretty realistic. You know, if you were on Mars and somebody you were with killed somebody, how would you handle it? I think there's merits to both sides, not necessarily feeling like it's right to kill somebody, but then again, in that situation, what do, you know? But I'm really curious to see what all of you think. For the next video, I'm going to try to get Baraska done over the weekend and upload it on Monday or Tuesday, because I'm going on my trip for a few days on Tuesday, and I'd like to get that done before I go, just so you all have something nice and long to listen to. I'm not really going to be gone that long. I'm only going to be gone a few, like 4 days, but yeah. I don't really think I have anything else to say. I'll be in the comments like I normally am, and I hope you have a great weekend.